take this stuff back to your editors. Okay? You've only heard, one half of this evening's presentation about. We're going to talk about now the implications that Brigadier General Stephen Lufkin alluded to with corporations and how President Eisenhower was sold out. So now we have a body of information, and now we're going to proceed to try to come to grips with what the geopolitical implications are of this, and which is even more staggering. So what I'm going to do now is introduce someone that I feel very, very strongly about, and he came forward last September 25th. And he's not an ufologist. He's not someone who is steeped in this information. He's someone who has served our country in the bravest of ways by coming forward and using his name and his integrity. And believe me, when you get into this field, your integrity is at stake. Make no mistake about that. Criticism comes from all sections. So I wanted to introduce to you the Honorable Paul Hellyer, who, as you probably know, served as the Minister of National Defense under the Lester B. Pearson government here in Canada. And last September he said, as Michael alluded to, that UFOs are as real as the planes that fly over our head. And those words will resonate in Canadian society, as far as I'm concerned, until this issue comes to the forefront. And once again, I don't want to harp on it, but the media, I challenge you to engage this issue in the most stringent of ways. And don't let anyone tell you that this stuff is bogus, because it is information that is profound. And then we have a man here, Paul Hellyer, who's willing to stand up and be counted and say, people, please listen. So, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Hellyer.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out tonight and learning more about what I consider to be one of the most important subjects facing the future of the world at the present time. As Victor said last September, I went public as someone who believes that UFOs are real. I didn't do that on a whim. I was totally convinced. I read a book, which I would commend to any of you who are interested in the subject, written by Colonel Philip J. Corso, retired United States Army intelligence officer, who actually saw one of the cadavers and who was involved in feeding some of the wreckage from the Roswell crash into United States industry to be reverse engineered for the benefit of the United States military forces, the Army in particular, which was the force that he was working for, and also, as it turned out, for some of us. In his book, he makes it clear that some of the ideas were not new ideas, but what happened was that with the help of the technology from the wreckage at Roswell, the United States industry was able to speed up the development of a whole range of products, to speed it up immeasurably by years, and in some cases maybe even decades. And so this was something that really influenced me, and I told this story in September. I'll repeat it again. I just happened to take this book with me when I was going on holiday last summer, and I was reading it, and my nephew, Philip, came along, asked me what I was reading, and I told him, gave him a little bit of the information from the book, and he said, well, I'm very skeptical, and walked away. 2 days later, he phoned me and said, I just talked to my friend, who's a retired general of the United States Air Force, and I mentioned the book to him, and he said, every word is true and more. Well, that was good to hear when I had already made up my mind that this was authentic stuff. I went through my mind and said, is it possible that someone could fabricate this story? Is it possible that it could be like the life of Pi and that someone had just had such a wonderful imagination that they could put together all this stuff? I came to the conclusion that the answer was no. There were too many dates, too many real people that I knew about, and too many facts that were impossible to refute. So before I went public in September, I phoned Philip and asked him if he would give me the general's number because I had met him at a air show a couple of years earlier, and phoned him. So I did, and hello, General, it's good to talk to you, and I think Philip told you why I'm calling. It's about Corshell's book, and he just repeated every word of it's true and more. So then for 20 minutes, he proceeded to talk about the more. And there were some things he couldn't talk about, but even what he did talk about was as fascinating as anything I've heard in a long time, perhaps until today with spending 2 or 3 hours with Dr. Stephen Greer. In any event, it wasn't the fact that there are UFOs, which I am absolutely, totally convinced there are, that made me go public. As I said at the time, it is the policy implications. I'm a policy wonk. I'm concerned about the future of our society. I'm concerned about the future of our planet. And I'm concerned about governments that claim to be democratic and where somebody other than the elected officials are running the show. And that seems to, well, that's one of my major concerns. But they're all tremendous concerns. I don't know how many of you have heard of Lewis Latham's, the editor of Harper's Magazine's theory that the United States has two governments, the permanent and the provisional. The permanent government consists of the Fortune 500, the big legal firms in Washington that do their legal work, and the big public relations firms in Washington that do their public relations, and the top civil servants, both civil and military. And they run the United States. And every once in a while, here I paraphrase a little bit, they have a charade called an election. And the permanent government picks the actors to go on the stage. And once they pick them, they finance them and nobody else need apply. Because getting elected is so expensive that you need a tremendous amount of money, and they put up the money to get their men elected. And they try to pick actors that won't improvise too much. They will read the scripts the way they're written. And then they don't always tell them everything. Something I'm finding out as I'm digging deeper and deeper into this is that there are at least 2 presidents of the United States who are not fully briefed on the subject we're talking about tonight. And you might say, you've got to be kidding. But I'm not kidding. This is so tightly held that even chiefs of intelligence and presidents of the United States have not been fully apprised as to what's going on and why. So there's the issue of governance, of whether it's democracy, or plutocracy, who's running the United States, who's running the world. Well, often, and I know this from experience, it's not the people you elect and hold accountable. It's a lot of people who are unelected and not held accountable. And then the second major issue is the question of saving the planet literally. We've been talking about the Kyoto Agreement. Our government has shown a lack of enthusiasm for it. We can see the polar ice caps melting. There's evidence all around us that we're in danger if we don't do something. And it's just a question of time. It isn't a question of if, it's only a question of when. And what we have to answer is, do we care? We will probably live out our natural lives. Why aren't they revealing it and working on saving the planet now? Well, the answer, I think you probably know, is because there are a lot of people with trillions of dollars invested in oil fields that don't really want this information out for quite a long while until the oil fields are depleted and they've got their money out 3 or 4 times over. Now that's maybe speculation, but you don't have to be a wizard to know what would happen if the information came out and we had to adapt. We could adapt, but it would cause a very great disruption. And a lot of people would lose a lot of money. And I know a lot of people that don't like losing a lot of money, especially if they've got a lot of power and can avoid it. So this is, I think, the second major issue. Well, and the third one, which I think is equally important, is that as Minister of National Defense, I sort of understand to a certain extent the military mind. Most of them wonderful people, and I say that without any reservation. And Canadian soldiers, sailors, and airmen are as good as there are in the world, and we can be very proud of them. And they do a fantastic job, even though we don't support them properly, with the personnel and the equipment that they deserve. But there are some people in this clique which involves some military people, but not all. Because as Dr. Hellyer will tell you later, and I hope you'll ask him this question, he has talked to senior people in the United States military that haven't a clue what's going on. Even though you would say, you're kidding. And he will say, no, I'm not kidding. People who should have known what was going on, not told, and told they had no right to know. Why? I think because, as General Eisenhower probably saw ahead, there are people who have a vested interest in the arms industry and want to keep building and building, and if they don't have an enemy, they create another one. So first you have the Cold War, and then you have a phony war against terrorism, and then when that runs out, you're going to be faced with this extraterrestrial threat, and we, the people of the world, are going to have to get together and squander all of our money to build defenses to try and protect ourselves against the ETs. Even though they've probably been here for 2,000 years and haven't done us any great harm in all that time. Well, this is tremendously important. And, you know, in Colonel Corso's book, he talks about Star Wars years ago. What was the purpose? Primarily to prepare a defense against the ETs. And what is a lot of the reverse engineering and new engineering of some of these sophisticated weapon systems being about? To prepare weapons to shoot them down. And if we start shooting them down, when they're probably still decades or centuries ahead of us in technology, are they going to like it? And if they don't like it, what are they going to do about it? And I don't want to know the answer to that question, because I don't want us to take them on for size. I want, as a lot of members of the Exopolitics Institute want, is to try and make contact and say, what can we learn from you that will help us save our planet, save our civilization, reduce some of the disparity between the wealthiest people of the world and the poorest, and give us a more abundant life for everyone here. Because that is possible. So we're not talking about small states here. We're not talking, about some politician that was caught spending the weekends with the blonde that wasn't his wife, or some major story that would get all the newspapers and get 2 or 3 pages and follow-up stories. Some people think those are the important stories. I haven't been involved in one so far. Trying to escape. They're maybe interesting, a little titillation, that kind of thing. But in the long run, they don't matter who. But who's running the world matters. Whether we save the world or not matters. And whether we get into an intergalactic war matters, because all of us are inevitably going to be affected directly or indirectly in some way that we would really not want to see. So that's basically the reason I'm here. Dr. Greer is the expert. I'll leave the technical questions to him because I've never talked to anyone who's known as much about all of these things as he does. He blew my mind for 2.5 hours today. And I know that he won't talk about all the things because he won't have time. But I think he will answer your questions about anything you want to know about the U.S. military, who knows, what they know, why the right people don't know, and why we're not getting the information that we deserve to have. So I just hope you'll give him a very warm reception, and I just say thank God for Dr. Greer and people like him, but especially Dr. Greer for his disclosure project. If you get one of his DVDs and watch it through about twice, you'll want to go out and march on Parliament Hill and say, look, start an inquiry, find out what this is all about. Lots of witnesses that he could bring up that would talk openly about the problems, and get it all out in the open before it's too late, because that's what we really want, that's what it's all about. Thank you.
Need I say more? Okay, what I'm going to do now is just ask a Canadian representative from the Disclosure Project, David Schuschuk, to come forward to introduce Dr. Greer.
Thanks, Victor. My name is David Schuschuk, and I've been involved with the Disclosure Project in a pretty small way in Toronto for the last 4 years. And I'll go back into my background a little bit more later, but as we've seen tonight, it's really about questions. That's where I start coming from. And questions have sort of been hanging over the world for at least the last 60 years. Probably much longer than that, but certainly that long. And just to go over those questions, there's 3 of them. And again, we have, why are we still using obsolete and polluting energy generation and transportation technology when effective alternatives are known and have been demonstrated? Why is that the case? Why and how does a small group of people control and manipulate the economy, energy, politics, technological development, medicine, and media, and a whole lot of other fields? Why is this going on continuously? And why are we putting up with it? And why is the enormous evidence for extraterrestrial civilizations, why is it being held secret or outright denied? And there's one other question. Why is it when you ask these questions too often or too loudly, things start happening to you? You can be ridiculed, shunned, harassed, offered bribes, co-opted, threatened, and have attempts on your life and on those people close to you. Stephen Greer has looked all of that in the face for years, and he is not doing it. He put a highly successful and honored career on hold to do this. That career was as an emergency physician and chairman of the Department of Emergency Medicine at Caldwell Memorial Hospital in North Carolina. He's also a lifetime member of Alpha Omega Alpha, which is the most prestigious medical honor society in the United States. Now, he walked away from that to essentially take on the volunteer positions as head of the Disclosure Project, Space Energy Access Systems Incorporated, and CSIP. And thrown in on the deal, he'd get to watch his back, pretty much on an ongoing basis. Now, how many of us sitting in this room would pick up a cause like that and pay such a price? Not many, if any of us. Now, some of the things Stephen will say, and some of the evidence he presents will seem to be pretty much out there. And I wouldn't blame anyone for being skeptical. My own background is in research methods and statistics, which I taught at the University of Toronto for 13 years. Now, skepticism is something I basically made a living by. If something doesn't add up, it doesn't even make it to the Navy file, as far as I'm concerned. But I decided, after first becoming acquainted with what Stephen was doing, to look into things personally. And after a remarkably short amount of time, I was able to personally verify, firsthand, for myself, some of the claims and things that Stephen Greer said. And at first, those claims seemed utterly incredible. But believe me, when you personally verify something, and you get lots of independent confirmation from sources, very different sources, it starts to lend a lot of credibility to everything else he has to say. Now, if Stephen Greer says to you that he had a meeting with a certain public official, and that certain things were discussed, or that certain events took place that aren't commonly known or discussed, you can be sure that it happened. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree 100% with every conclusion he comes to. Certainly, I don't see eye to eye on every last bit of detail of his perspective, but that is neither here nor there. We need to be asking the questions and looking at the evidence that he and the Disclosure Project witnesses have brought to the table at great personal cost and risk. That evidence and those questions need to be part of everyday public discourse and political debate. The future of humanity demands on that debate at least taking place and then action being taken upon it. I suggest we take this opportunity to listen very closely to what he has to say. Please welcome Stephen Greer.
Thank you, Mr. Hellyer and Victor. It's an honor to be here, to be back in Toronto, and to address you and members of the media. This is the 5th year anniversary of the National Press Club, where the first of these top-secret witnesses stepped forward with the whole world watching. They were allowed to watch briefly before the intelligence people pulled it off the airwaves. I will give you an idea of how well wrapped this whole thing is. The National Press Club, 5 years ago today, with 22 of these military and intelligence witnesses in front of the world's cameras, and it being live webcasts on the internet. It was the most watched internet broadcast at that time in the history of the internet. The broadcasting entity is the entity that hosts CNN and the Department of Defense at the National Press Club. They said there were so many people trying to see it, it crashed their bandwidth. They used up all their bandwidth. But then, the first hour of it was externally electronically jammed, probably from the National Security Agency of the United States. It took 1 hour after the beginning of it for it then to get loaded on so you, the people, could see it. They don't want you to know the truth. And I'm going to share with you the truth that we know. I began this effort in 1990, actually. We have now nearly 500 of these military and intelligence and corporate witnesses. Some of these witnesses are from corporations such as Lockheed, Northrop, SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation, E-Systems, Raytheon, and others. These corporations are sitting on the definitive solution to a good many of the world's most pressing problems, up to and including the need to replace the fossil fuel, meaning oil, gas, coal, nuclear power systems, with sustainable energy and propulsion systems, which a kleptocracy have brought from you and from us for the last 50 years. It's time that we say no to that, and it's time for the disclosure of the truth. On December 13, 1993, I was in the unenviable, dreadful position of having been asked by the Director of Central Intelligence of the United States, who had just been appointed by President Clinton to brief him and the Clinton administration on this problem. My uncle was the senior project engineer who designed the lunar module that landed on the moon. And I'm just a country doctor from North Carolina, actually. But I had an interest in this since childhood, and I began to study this very intensely beginning again in 1990. By 1993, we had identified several dozen of these military witnesses. We had identified nearly 4,000 cases where these objects had landed on terra firma and left physical evidence. We had identified over 3,000 military and civilian professional airline pilots who had encountered them with radar confirmation in many of those cases. We had several thousand pages of official, not hoax, officially released government documents that we had acquired from the United States, Canada, one of the most important documents is from Canada from 1951, and from the KGB files, which were translated for us. The memo I got from the point of contact to the Director of Central Intelligence said, Dr. Greer, the President and the CIA Director have made directed inquiries into this matter and have been denied access. This I thought to be a bold-faced lie, frankly. I said, this must be a prevarication. But I said, I'll come and brief him anyway, because I'm on no secret project, and I'll just share what I know. So under the cover of a dinner party in Washington, outside Washington, Arlington, I was invited with my wife and the CIA Director and his wife, who was the Chief Operating Officer of the National Academy of Sciences, and my host and his wife. By the way, how you like this? The day that we went, I learned that the hostess had no idea who was coming for dinner. Imagine being the hostess with the mostess and being told, honey, Dr. Greer, who's an expert on extraterrestrial intelligence, and the Director of Central Intelligence is coming for dinner tonight. He wouldn't tell her until an hour or so before we arrived. Well, when this meeting began, I spent 10 minutes on the evidence. The CIA Director stopped me and said, I know these things are real, but I want to know why. As Mr. Hellyer said, I don't know about it. What are the implications of this secrecy? Who is keeping this secret from us? And what is their agenda? That, my fellow denizens of the earth, are what we spent the next 3 hours discussing. And that is the pressing issue of our time. Because while many people think this issue is about little green men, on the contrary, it's about the future of this planet and who will set the agenda for this planet. And will it be the people of the earth and their representatives, or will it be a kleptocracy who have stolen from us 50 years of our history, where we now face ourselves in war after war in the Middle East over oil, where we see both polar ice caps melting, where we have a clandestine operation which has already placed very powerful weapon systems in space which are tracking and targeting completely non-hostile extraterrestrial vehicles. This is of the utmost importance. Shortly after this meeting with the CIA Director, a good friend of the President's came to my home. And he said, you know, the President's very supportive of having this information come out, but he isn't going to do what you've asked. And I had asked the CIA Director and the President, through his National Security Advisor and some other folks working with him, to do the disclosure project as an official executive order. And this man sat, and you know, it's stunning to think about, excuse me, at my dining room table with my wife and children, and said, well, he's very supportive of this, but we're convinced that if the President does what you're recommending, he will end up like Jack Kennedy. Which time I burst out laughing. You know, I thought the man was, of course, joking. He stopped me and says, no, we are not joking. President Clinton did not want to pursue this. I have subsequently met, and this is a partial list I will share with you, ranking members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Richard Bryan, who was on that committee from the state of Nevada, where Nellis Air Force Base is located. I have personally briefed the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the head of intelligence for the Joint Staff, and also the Secretary General of the United Nations and his family, Boutros Ghali. amongst others. What I found was that the vast majority of people that we think are running our governments are being lied to or denied access. And this permanent, if you will, government, as opposed to the provisional one, I like that analogy, is the one running the show. We have neither elected them nor appointed them. The problem with that, as Eisenhower warned in his last address to the nation in 1961 as he was leaving office, when he said, beware the military-industrial complex because it will get out of control and be a threat to our security and to our democracy. Why did a five-star, two-term conservative Republican president say this? Because, as this attorney that you just heard has said, he knew that there had already been a complete, silent coup d'etat of the organs of the military, intelligence, and financial systems. This is a serious problem, and it's time for both the public and the media to take it very seriously. The issue cannot be overstated in terms of what its implications are. Imagine if this subject can be properly disclosed in Canada. This is my great hope to the north. I've almost despaired of the United States. I say this as a patriotic American whose mother's family were some of the original founders of the United States. And I look to Canada and I look to some other countries and say, perhaps you can reach your elected officials and ask them, and there's a petition for you to sign for this to happen, to hold open, secrecy-free hearings. And I will give whoever is the investigator for whatever Senate or Parliament committee who inquires into this matter, the list, name, phone numbers, all the information of all 450 of these military and intelligence witnesses. We have, in many senses, reached a crossroads in our civilization. We have reached the point where we will have to close one chapter in the human experience. It is childhood's end. We must leave the rampages of adolescence behind and become a mature civilization, living together in peace on this planet and going out in space together in peace. There is only one future that is possible, and it is a future of peace and of disclosure and of truth. Without it, we will not be able to make this transition across this great divide between our dreams and the reality of a civilization which is reaching terminus. Make no mistake about it. As I flew up to Montreal to give a lecture up in Montreal this past weekend, fate put me beside the head of sustainability and the environment for a company you have here called Alcan. I guess you've heard of it. I wasn't familiar. It's a $20 billion company, big aluminum company. And we started talking about this. He says, you know, nothing we're doing is sustainable at Alcan. It takes gigawatts of power for us to get aluminum, for us to make beverage cans, out of the ore. And we're burning fossil fuels and we're using all kinds of resources to do it. I said, yes, isn't that a shame? Because Ben Rich, the head of Lockheed Skunk Works, before he passed away, told 3 members of the Disclosure Project team that we already had the means to generate infinite amounts of energy, to travel among the stars at superluminal velocities, but that these technologies were locked away in a black box, and that it would take an act of God to get them out to the public. I'm quoting. I think it's time that perhaps maybe God looks through us. It's time for us to say, all right, if our leaders will not do it, let the people lead the leaders, and they'll follow. Perhaps it is time to allow ourselves to reach the potential of the future of humanity and leave to our children and our grandchildren and all those that come behind us a sustainable civilization living in peace, and that will be the generation to achieve that seminal hallmark in human evolution. Thank you.
Thank you.